Joining this live town hall discussion on education during the coronavirus pandemic. This town hall is hosted by Congressman Heck, who represents Washington's 10th Congressional District. We are also lucky to have a very special and knowledgeable guest with us tonight, Chris Reykdal, Washington's Superintendent of Public Instruction. We've been collecting questions from you through social media and constituent mail, and we'll be using those questions to drive this discussion. If you're watching this live on Facebook and have a question, please ask it in the comments section of this video, and we'll try to get to some of the questions from live viewers. Before we get to questions, I'm going to hand it over to Congressman Heck and then Superintendent Reykdal for some opening remarks. Congressman Heck?
Thank you, Lauren. First, I want to thank all of you who are joining this evening for what is undoubtedly one of the most important conversations we can have about our reaction to the COVID-19 virus. Secondly, I want to thank my guest, Chris Reykdal, the Superintendent of Public Instruction, who is a very special guy, let me tell you. The youngest of 8 children, he went on to graduate from WSU as a summa cum laude graduate, and then he kind of took a slight detour, a mishap, and went to the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill for his master's degree that launched him on a very successful career, first as a classroom teacher. Later, however, he was a school board member and a member of the state legislature, and then of course was elected state superintendent of public instruction. And he is, in all fairness and full disclosure, a good friend of mine and somebody whose work I respect very much. I'm more anxious to get to the questions, but before we do that, Chris, if you've got any opening comments you want to make, now's the time to do it.
Great. Thank you, Congressman Heck, and everyone who's tuned in today. It's been a remarkable 2.5 months, and everyone has felt the impact of COVID-19 and its subsequent impacts on education and the economy and all of our daily lives. So I mostly want to start off with a thank you to Washingtonians. I remind people pretty regularly that we're 2.5% of the U.S. population, but fortunately only 1.1% or so of the fatalities. So still too many and sad. But our response was immediate and has had a positive impact, but the work remains, and we want to get our schools open this fall, but we want to do it safely.
Lauren, let's get started with questions.
Great. So our first question comes from Shane from Facebook and is, will school start again in the fall, or will it be stay at home with online classes? Superintendent Reykdal?
Great. We've got a large group we put together, over 120 people statewide, very diverse, a lot of perspectives to build a framework to open our schools this fall. That's our goal. And it is a function of public health, of course, but the opportunity is very much in front of us if we can do the right things. It'll come with a lot of health protocols, but the goal here is to open schools and then be prepared in some regions to have hybrid models where some of that will continue to be delivered at a distance. Or in some cases, if cases pop up in schools, they need to be able to pivot relatively quickly to an online model. But the goal here is a very intensive planning effort to open this fall safely. And we've all got a role in making sure that can happen effectively.
Chris, I thought I had read that large work group you've got examining this has a tentative deadline to come up with these specific recommendations or options in early June, mid-June. Did I read that correctly? Is that what you were hoping?
Yeah, really.
Circumstance?
Early June, we think there's a regulatory side coming from Department of Health that'll tell us what sort of health conditions we have to follow. We want to build a menu of options for school districts based on their particular situation and geography. And then we definitely want the legislature to give us some clarification in June about the stability of their budgets for at least the next year. If they have all 3 of those pieces, they'll be ready to plan effectively.
So I realize it isn't yet early June and they haven't made their recommendations, but I will imagine that parents sitting out there and watching would like some kind of an idea of the kinds of models that you're looking at. What might school look like this fall in the way of a list of options? And I want to clarify and qualify that you have not, the work group has not made its recommendation yet, but people are probably pretty curious just in exactly what kinds of terms are people thinking about?
Well, definitely menus, right? And then blended options. So people will pick and choose a school district within the health framework, what's possible for them. But everything from a full open in places that can maintain 6 feet of distance and can do screening and has all the proper PPE necessary. There are lots of districts around the state of Washington who could pull that off right now safely. Their buildings allow for it. Their size and density allows for it. Others are incredibly dense. When you go to a 2,000 person high school and you serve 500 kids at a time in a cafeteria, that's not going to happen. Very unlikely. So they would be looking at cohort models or staggered start times, or even blended models where kids are in school for part of the day and learning at a distance for part of the day. Some districts may end up saying, we really want to focus our attention on our K through sixth graders and have them come every day face to face in safe numbers, and we want to put our energy and distance learning on our high school students who may be more equipped to have success there. So our goal is a list of things that meet the health requirements but are flexible enough that local communities can make local choices.
And do you well imagine, therefore, Chris, that come the opening of school on the opening day, we're going to see lots of different kinds of things occurring out there depending on the local circumstance?
I think so. We have to watch the progression of the virus over the summer. If we do our jobs well, and we've done a pretty good job in the state of Washington with our distancing, our masks, our cleaning, our hygiene practices. If we don't have a spike in cases prior to that, I think you're going to see a real bias to getting kids in face to face that first day with all the right protocols. But obviously, if something happens this summer and things don't go very well, we open up too fast or people don't have sort of the regiment, you're not just going to have nervous school systems to open. You're going to have nervous parents who won't want to send their kids to school. And in that model, districts need to be poised to balance two systems at the same time or to pivot between them.
What can you say about the experience thus far for the last 10 weeks or however long it's been? Where is it that you think we weren't prepared? Because obviously this was all a great surprise on us. Where have your concerns been about the last 10 weeks experience that we've had?
Well, I'll start with the concerns. It's the gap. We knew that any system that relied on technology was going to create haves and have-nots, and our system doesn't use technology as a basic education component. It's not like textbooks or classrooms or heat or gymnasiums that we can guarantee in a facility. This has always been a private thing, right? You bought internet connection or you didn't, based on your family income and your resources and your geography. You may be in an area that doesn't even have an option. So that got exacerbated immediately, and it's clear to all of us now that we have to expand that opportunity for kids. Where I'm, I guess, honestly hopeful is 1.6 billion students around the planet are out of school, and we're seeing them return in some other countries. They didn't all say we're going to permanently be online. They brought them back safely to physical schools where there's really good support systems. Kids learn and they get skills interacting. They get health and nutrition services. There's nurses there, right? There's mental health supports. So we've seen other countries show us some models that are pretty good. 53 million American kids are out of school in a traditional way right now. So I get a lot of people who say, my kid's losing ground and we're losing ground to the world. We really aren't, but the whole planet has lost 3 months of learning in a traditional sense. We're a state that chose to stay engaged, even though it's been clunky in places, but we said we're going to focus on continuous learning. We had some colleagues in other states say, no, we're going to let that totally be up to locals and they can or can't keep going if they want to. We made a different decision. So some good, positive, a lot of growth and online success, a lot of struggles though in connectivity and the totally disparate opportunity based on your community. So we got to figure out a way to make that a normal practice, a consistent practice around the state.
There's a lot of talk about what our world's going to look like in a post-COVID world. And there's speculation to the effect that these changes, some of which will continue, that there are structural changes in how our economy works and how society functions that will be as a result of this. And I'm wondering, as it relates to education, Chris, we're obviously making giant leaps forward, a couple steps forward, a couple steps backward on the use of technology. Do you think that there will be, on an ongoing basis, a tendency to use more online learning than there has to date? Or do you think when we get past the virus that we will snap back to what it is that we have known for a couple, 3, 4 generations?
I think it's going to be more permanent, but at a scale that makes sense. So it's not a shift to it. It's not a good learning model for most kids, but more students want some of it. And a lot of our services we've been delivering through tech, and it's been disparate, right? If you want to check your grades, have your parents get involved in your high school and beyond plan, almost all of that's digital right now. So some students have had access, some haven't. So equalizing the opportunity is big. It'll be transformative. I think middle and high school students will want more opportunities. I'd like to join a lot of other states and at least getting kids competencies around learning online. It doesn't have to be every class, of course, but we should have some requirement that students know how to do that. That's how they'll learn as adults mostly. Most of us as adults don't go back to a college or university for a year or two. We pick up courses along the way, mostly at a distance. And we've already been making strides to transform the junior senior year. And one of the things that will be obvious out of this is how many kids said, I'm kind of ready to go to the next step. And why am I sitting here waiting around for some classes my junior, senior year? I've met competency, I've met standards. I'm ready to go. We have those systems as Running Start in college and high school, but we need to make those way more ubiquitous for students because many of them are talented. And it isn't about sitting around getting your last 12 credits or having to force 1,000 instructional hours into your day. It's when are you ready and competent to have success at the next step? That's what we should measure. And boy, the system has had an eye-opening opportunity here to focus on standards and not seat time, and that will forever change. I am confident we will build better systems, particularly for our high school kids.
You mentioned haves and have-nots. My apologies, Lauren. I've got a whole bunch of questions for my friend Chris. And one of the areas that has concerned me most, frankly, are the students who have IEPs, individual educational plans, usually thought of as special education kids. And it seems to me that it might be even more difficult to provide distance learning. Maybe I'm wrong, but I am concerned about that. So what would your observation be about our ability thus far to provide those students with the education that they deserve and that we are required to provide? Is it materially different from the rest of the students? And if so, what are some of the kinds of things that can be done, are being done to help with that population?
Let me start with some myth busting and then really get to the substance of the question. Well, I'll answer it first. Yes, it is more challenging for students with disabilities in most cases, but the myth busting is who these students are. So we all have this sense, mostly as adults, when we went through school many, many years ago and didn't have a real understanding of what it means to have a cognitive disability or learning disability. It's some kid in a resource room. That is a very small percentage of our students with disabilities. Most of them have IQs and capacities to have as much or more success as their peers, like to the tune of more than 90% of them. They have a disability. I could not function without my glasses. I need an accommodation, and suddenly I'm very successful in my reading, but I need an accommodation. Most of our students with IEPs are like that. They need an accommodation, and they are very high functioning in their ability to have success. Many of them have seamlessly transitioned to online learning and have had great results. But there is a percentage of our students with IEPs who have significant or more profound needs, and the system didn't work well. A two-dimensional screen with a teacher 20 miles away can't deliver speech therapy in a meaningful way. We have kids with significant developmental disabilities who need physical supports to move about their day. The level of need is really different. There are some who struggled mightily in this, and the system was not able to accommodate them. But I would definitely always challenge people to kind of be sophisticated about that, to say all the kids on IEP struggled. It's 140,000 kids statewide, and many of them had great success with this. So what we challenge districts to do is document where kids' services really could not be effectively delivered in this modality. Document it so you can come back this summer with what we call compensatory time, bringing back those services and helping get students back to where they were or developing beyond where they were. And then this fall is entirely about targeting supports for those students. So it's been a very mixed result, and it is an area where we need a lot of attention. And we've put a lot of state resources in this area over the last couple of years, but then COVID-19 really changed the game.
Well, I have 1,000 questions, but I'm hogging the show, Lauren. So let's get back to some of our constituents and allow them to get in the auction here.
All right. So we have two live Facebook comments. One from Karen saying broadband is a huge issue in our house when there are 3 of us online at once. And Amanda says Wi-Fi should be a public utility so everyone can have access. Congressman, would you like to comment on that?
Couldn't agree more. Broadband is the rural electrification of the 21st century. It's that straightforward. Some of us actually are old enough to have remembered people who were older when we were younger, who fought the great political battle to bring electricity throughout America and especially to rural areas. But it's not just a rural issue. It's an issue in a lot of communities. And it is simply that. It is a foundational utility that needs to be available to everybody in a quality and in an affordable way. There have been money in the last couple of bills that we have passed to provide grants to enable that to be extended more. And there is very considerable discussion being had about what to do going forward. So right now we're involved at the congressional level in considerable mitigation efforts to keep this economy from free falling any faster, to kind of abate that free fall. Eventually, what we will get to is the rebuilding of the economy. And in that context, we're going to have a lot of talk about investing in infrastructure to enable this economy to grow once again and provide quality jobs, hopefully in a fairer way than the economy has in the past. And there is no question in my mind that one of the elements of infrastructure investment that we will look at is a significant investment in broadband extension to, as I hope, 100% of American families, because they cannot function in this society without it. It is the electrification of the 21st century. Chris?
Couldn't agree more. This is a priority for our state. It's going to need federal help, and thank you for your leadership in part on this. I will tell you, I can fill a little gap right now. So until we get that last mile and that last fiber into each home, we do have thousands of students who cannot afford it, even though they live in a place that's already accessible by fixed line or wireless connectivity. And we're going to use some of our federal emergency funds here to purchase a year's worth of service for those families. So until we get through the next school year, as we navigate a very complex and likely hybrid kinds of models, we just want to increase connectivity. But we'll only have one-time money for a year to do that. And then our legislature really has to step up and figure out if they want this to be a basic ed right or not. And then we got to figure out how to provide those families real connectivity that's reliable.
Our next question comes from another Facebook Live viewer, Carolyn Barclift. Carolyn says, there has been a mixed bag for the level of involvement in children in their education since it went distant. Will there be options for students over the summer to get kids caught up if they've fallen behind? And how will you recapture those kids who have not been participating well and engage them? Superintendent Reykdal?
Yeah, it's a really awesome and powerful question. We were asked by the system largely to figure out a grading system, for example, that made more sense during this time period. So you saw us get rid of Fs, for example, because some students just couldn't connect and it was not fair to give them a failing grade, impact their GPA and set them back. So we made every district adopt an I option, an incomplete option, where teachers just couldn't make a meaningful assessment of learning. That then compels the district to build learning plans for students. And we think that's gone quite well around the state in terms of documenting the needs for students who couldn't connect. And the opportunity this summer is really a function of the governor aligning his school closure order with his now kind of return to work orders. He's got us coming back in phases, and we're trying to meet with him now to align our summer opportunity. We know our schools are closed through June 19th, but there's a little less visibility on what we can do in July and August. We think we can start bringing back groups of students in less than 10 and maybe up to 50 if we can get some districts into phase 3. So I'm confident this summer is an opportunity to really catch up for those students who need it, but there's a little clarification we have to do to reconcile what he's doing for the larger economy versus the narrow executive order he put forward for schools.
Chris, how would school districts go about deciding who the limited number would be available to? Are we talking about students, for example, with IEPs, or students that didn't have broadband access that during this interim period of time may have been left behind? How would that decision be made?
Yeah, districts are collecting their data on a regular basis about the IEPs where the services couldn't be delivered at a distance. They definitely have an understanding of students who could not make connectivity, or maybe they did, but for other reasons just checked out, could not be a part of this or chose not to. They have a really good understanding of who they are. And then they would make priority about, hey, is this a student with really high function and competency and kind of met the standards already, or is this a student who really needs support immediately? And so they'll make that decision locally. I just got to give them the green light to say you can come in. But then again, we also kept our staffs really engaged through all this. And so we're talking the challenge of supplemental contracts and making sure that some folks want to come in either as volunteers or to take on additional workload. And that's not unusual. We do some of that in the summer. But often it's seniors catching up, or it's, a couple other smaller opportunities. This will be on a bigger scale. And the Seattle district, for example, has already made clear they're going to have thousands of students come back this summer.
Where do you get the money, Chris? That wasn't budgeted at the beginning of the school year. And obviously you're not talking about all students, but you're talking about a lot of students. And therefore you're talking about expense. The legislature had left town before this was fully anticipated or felt. So where do you get the money?
Districts will make priority with what they have because there isn't new state money. We will soon push out for them the Easter money. This is the CARES Act money that was approved by you and your colleagues.
The federal money, yes.
Federal money, yeah. There's about 200 million going out to districts, so it's meaningful. But for context for everyone tuning in, it's about 1.3% of the equivalent budget of our state here for education. So it's not a transformational thing, but it's a real opportunity for districts to address some of these needs. And I know some of them already have plans to do that.
On a related note, we got a question through Facebook earlier from Angie saying, how likely is it that education funding for the 2021 school year will take a major hit? Is local education agency funding also going to be significantly reduced? Congressman Heck?
Well, Chris is probably better positioned to answer that question than I am, but I do have some work in this field and some history in this area myself, being the past co-chairman of the House Education Committee. And in fact, 32 years ago, ran for the office that Chris holds. The fact is that Washington State has the strongest constitutional guarantee of support for public education of any state in the United States. It is the paramount duty. I'm not making that term up. That's literally what the Constitution says. It's the paramount duty of the state to make ample provision for the education of all children, et cetera, in Article 9, Section 1. So there is a portion of the K-12 budget that could be subject to reduction, but basic education is not part of it. It's not as though they won't come under stress if the legislature doesn't compensate for it. And Chris may want to put that a little bit in context to give you an idea about how much that is. But by and large, it is fair to say that constitutional protection is extended to K-12 in a way that it isn't for virtually any other activity of state government. Chris?
Yeah, and it's gotten stronger. So over the last couple of years, in a very bipartisan way, our legislature has strengthened what they put in that basic education protected box. They delivered documents literally to the court, the state Supreme Court, to say, hey, we've met the ruling of the court in the McCleary case. We are now amply funding basic ed. And I can disagree with them on a couple of points here for sure, but they've put a lot of things into that to the tune that about 96.5% of all the money they appropriate, even their staff agrees is basic ed now and protected. So there's definitely some areas we have to make sure we can continue to hold on to, but for the most part, in a very bipartisan way, our state legislature has met their sort of shared passion for the paramount duty. And so we're in pretty good shape. Honestly, I think the bigger risk is that we still have about 17 or 18% of budgets on average statewide that are local levies. And that's way down from where they were a couple of years ago because the state has put in so much more. But a district who struggles to pass a levy probably has a lot more risk than anything coming from the state legislature at this point.
So, Chris, in that regard, I don't recall the data here. What is the history of levy success or failure as it relates to economic cycles? Intuitively, you might conclude that it's harder to pass a levy when people are stressed, when the economy is down or unemployment is up, but I don't actually know that. Do you?
Mm-hmm. There's a little correlation there, but we generally in good times and bad times enjoy very, very high success rates on traditional operating levies, well in excess of 90%. We have a category that's been growing lately, what we call technology levies. Those don't have the same success. Those are 10, 15, 20 points lower. Some people still see technology as this luxury to have. They might be rethinking that now. And then the ones that struggle, of course, the most in any time are capital bonds, because you need a 60% vote of your local community to authorize those. And it's the only way you can access state matching money for capital. So we'll observe that through the recession. And because all of those are property tax based, there's definitely some risk to them. But generally, our operating levies enjoy tremendous support statewide because all the money stays local and people see what it does in the community and they're confident that it supports their schools.
Thank you. So we're hearing that there are some connectivity issues. And so I just wanted to say that we'll be posting this entire program on Facebook afterwards if you're having trouble viewing now. And for our next question, it is from Ash on Twitter. How is OSBI addressing the needs of parents who are working full-time from home or otherwise and don't have time or capacity to direct their kids' homeschooling activities. Superintendent Reykdal?
Yeah, I mean, this has been the challenge literally for, almost every nation around the planet and all of the states. Every parent is struggling with this. And on the front end of a crisis where you don't really understand the epidemiology of the virus, of course, but you know it's bad and you know it's significantly more transmissible than even flu. All the states made tough decisions to close schools and ultimately mostly close down the rest of their economies. That's coming back now. There's this very complicated moment here where lots of parents are wanting to go back to work or can go back to work, and yet schools are closed. And that's a gap that exists in our state and candidly in all the states still right now. I don't think we're going to solve that this year. Our schools are going to be closed for the rest of the year with online models. It's why we are working so hard to get them open this fall. People have been gracious and they've understood the crisis we were in and the moment we were in and how consistent we acted as a nation around closing schools. So I think people sort of understand the complexity of it now, but it can't sustain itself that way. And so we're working really hard to get schools open for the fall. Parents will have to kind of deal with what they deal with in a normal year here pretty soon, which is typical summer where students are not there in their classrooms and parents are working. But we've got about 4 more weeks or so of the model where some families are getting back to work and their kids are learning online. It is not ideal. I would not redesign a system around this, especially for our elementary kids at all. But it is where we and 49 other states are. And we want to put our energy on getting the fall open so we don't have to repeat it.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from a live viewer, John. We didn't have testing this year and the sky didn't fall. Can we get rid of smarter balanced assessments? Superintendent Reykdal?
Oh, this is a good one. Thank you, John. So we test every single student in the country in every grade, starting in 3rd grade through 8th grade. So 3rd, 4th, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade every year, both in math and English language arts, and once in high school. And then they get an elementary, middle, and high school test in science. That is required by federal law and enforced by the U.S. Department of Education. And they can take our 7% of our federal money away if we don't follow the law. Our state chooses the Smarter Balanced Assessment Consortium to do that because we get to control a lot of that. We didn't want to be a part of one of these large test companies. So the answer is we still have to follow federal law. We got a waiver for this year only. There's lots of questions about our future. I will tell you there is a much smarter way to do this, in my opinion, and I will be authoring something more about this later, which is to go to what I call the National Assessment of Educational Progress, the NAEP program. It's a sampling methodology that doesn't spend $60, $80 million per year in each state to test every single kid, but it samples and it produces good national metrics so we can see how we're doing, because it's a common assessment, and it tells you absolutely how your state is performing, and with enough N size, if you will, we can also understand how student groups are performing in that. It would be a smarter way to go. It would still maintain the accountability system, and it would put back in the classroom the responsibility of knowing whether a 3rd grader is getting what they need to be successful in 4th grade. We've introduced a very complex testing regime in the United States of America, and we don't really respond any differently to it. We just spend hundreds of millions to do it, and we still move kids from 3rd to 4th grade. It is nice to know a little bit more about how students are performing, but we can do that in ways that are much more efficient. So need some help from the feds in the short term, and then we absolutely should get to a more systemic approach nationally than what we're doing today.
Chris, suggesting that they need help from the feds gives me license to pop off here about something about which I feel very strongly, as it turns out. Yes, of course, it's important to assess students so that you know how it is that you can help them, you know where they are at that place and time, so that you know what it is they need to have directed at them. But I will say it bluntly, I think we got carried way overboard on testing in this country, way overboard. And look, I just would invite anybody who is watching to think back upon their education experience. The people who had the biggest impact on us as teachers weren't people who tested us every day or every other day. They were people that cared about us as individuals and with whom we developed a relationship. I know for a fact that's the kind of teacher that Chris Reykdal was when he was teaching high school down in Longview, caring about the kids. A good teacher loves the act of teaching, loves their subject matter, and loves their students. And we have gotten so far away in that as we away from that, as we have had this obsession with testing over the last generation. Again, I think we need to assess students, but this constant taking of tests, I think, has actually gotten in the way of strong growth on the part of the students, including academic growth. There, you hit my button, Chris. I apologize.
A different Secretary of Education can help in this at some point too. And it's been bipartisan, I will tell you. There was as many challenges in the last administration around testing as there has been in this one. So it is not an ideological thing here.
Thank you.
Well, it's not a partisan thing.
Right.
Our next question comes from Jody and was posted on Facebook. Extracurricular activities for kids need to continue. They are vital for social emotional health, and kids aren't really endangered by this virus. Congressman Heck, would you like to comment on that?
Repeat the question, please, Lauren.
Yes.
I'm sorry.
Extracurricular activities for kids
Right.
need to continue. They are vital for social emotional health, and kids aren't really endangered by this virus.
I don't think that is what the science suggests, with all due respect, that kids are not endangered by it. They are capable of actually being infected by COVID. Furthermore, there are beginning to emerge some pretty interestingly disturbing stories about unique manifestations of the infection or the virus in children. Furthermore, they can be, as you suggest, more resilient to the more serious aspects of this, but nonetheless asymptomatic carriers. In other words, they may have it, they may not be showing symptoms, but they can spread it to others. So it's important within our broader population that we continue to practice all the public health recommendations that will keep not just our children safe, but our older population safe. It is true that older people are more impacted. Nearly a third of the deaths associated come from nursing homes. And in fact, about 80% or more of all deaths come from people who are age 65 or older. So you're right. It is a disease that has had worse effects on people as they grow older, or those who have other pre-existing conditions that make them vulnerable. But children are not immune from this disease at all. And I think we need to make sure that we're following public health guidelines.
Thank you. Our next question comes from a live viewer named Carol.
So, Lauren?
Oh, yes.
I want to go back to the spirit of her question, though, because it was about the importance of extracurricular activities. I couldn't agree more. As a matter of fact, as a result of all that excessive testing that I have observed over the last generation, it seemed to me that there was this enormous gravitational influence on schools to more narrow what it is that we really concentrated on, and often at the expense of these extracurricular activities, some of which are the very things that keep young people in school, that make them get up in the morning looking forward to going to school and are a part of their emotional, psychological, and sometimes academic growth.
Thank you. So this question is from Carol on Facebook. What will you do to keep teachers and staff safe while at work? Superintendent Reykdal?
This is definitely the substance of the work of the task force and what the Department of Health in our state is going through, and trying to parallel, the CDC and the guidelines they've put out. They're just guidelines at the CDC, and a lot of it makes a ton of sense, and some of it is really not very practical at all. But our state is absolutely trying to design a system that puts the safety and health of our students and our educators first and foremost, and we won't go forward with anything that can't do that. So in those kinds of contemplations, it is about ideally effective testing. We need lots of testing in this state. We've got to know how the disease is moving and who has it, so we can contact trace, isolate, and create a protective factor. Coming back to school will absolutely be about PPE. There will be some folks who need a lot of it if they're the particular educator or paraeducator or staff member who screens kids for thermal scans. Temperature checks are pretty consistent around the world for the nations that have come back to school. And those are the only people who would really get within 6 feet of a kid. Everyone else will likely be either recommended or required to wear masks. A regular cleaning of our classrooms. Turns out that hand sanitizer is significantly important in the spread of this because it's really about touching our faces and touching mucous membranes that give us the disease. There's less and less evidence that it's a risk to have a surface that is have been contaminated. So we will clean more aggressively for sure under any scenario, but it's really about making sure that people have personal hygiene options. So we won't move forward with something that doesn't protect our educators. And part of that honestly might be that the governor has to continue to make some executive level decisions about who comes to work. And it might be that the ultimate guidance or mandates are that, over 60 or over 65, they need a work option that does not involve close contact with other adults or students. And it's a complicated puzzle to then build an education system, because we've got a pretty good chunk of our educators over the age of 65, and almost all of our substitute teachers start approaching that age or more. So there's a lot of demographic challenges here, but we're not moving forward without keeping our staff safe. And that's what the group's going through right now.
Great. Our next question comes from another live viewer, Art. How will busing look given the shortage of drivers and buses and the inability to socially distance on a full bus? Superintendent Reykdal?
Well, Art, this is the one out of probably two things that still keep me from sleeping at night. I can see lots of solutions being formed around the classroom environment, around how we assess and how we learn and the technologies we deploy. But so many kids rely on us picking them up and getting them to school. And if we are not allowed to do that in the scale that we do today, but we clearly have an obligation to uphold a kid's access to learning, then you're talking about maybe changing who gets picked up. So most districts have a half-mile or 1 mile rule, and you need to walk or get parent transported inside of that. And it might be that some districts say, in order to meet the health guidelines and do the proper distancing on our buses, given that we're not going to get some infusion of brand new money from the state, that more parents are going to have to bring their kids to school. And we got to figure out who can do that and who can't make that a reality and prioritize those students on buses. So it is one of the many things that are challenging, but it is definitely the one that I do not have a solution for right now. It has got a lot of superintendents pretty nervous around the state right now, because it's the one variable that there is not an apparent answer to. So we're going to the literature of some other countries to see what the heck did they do and how did they figure it out. No good answers yet.
Data break. Point of curiosity, Chris, just remind us how many school districts do we have in this state, totaling how many students?
295 public school districts, 6 or 7 tribal compact schools, about a dozen or a little less than a dozen charter schools. Both the compacts and charters are very, very small in numbers. About 1.1 million kids in our state in the public system, and about 100,000 or so in private schools in the state of Washington.
About 10% private school enrollment, or a little less, actually.
Yeah, really consistently 9 or 10%. Yep.
Yeah. Thank you. Lauren?
Great. Our next question comes from constituent mail from Marcia. Childcare programs across the country and across Washington are struggling to keep their doors open. In Washington, they are dealing with drastically reduced incomes and the challenge of providing socially distant care without enough PPE or other essential supplies. If the system sinks, parents will not be able to go back to work. Please work to provide more funding for these hardworking heroes. Congressman Heck, would you like to comment?
Well, we're doing exactly that, and thank you for the question. I actually think the question about where are we going to be able to go into the future in terms of reopening society on a safe way, in a safe way, is fundamentally related to the question of schools that we're talking about with Chris, and childcare. And I don't think we have all the answers yet. As you have heard Chris describe, this is a huge system, 1.1 million kids, and involving a lot of different entities and a lot of different moving parts. And childcare, the same thing, much more decentralized, obviously, than the public school system. So for those who operate childcare centers, what Congress has done is provide the same kind of assistance to them that they have other small businesses. In fact, one of the very first almost heartbreaking stories I had about somebody that was denied what we call the PPP loan was from somebody who operated a pretty large and successful childcare facility. And she was looking at her business model cratering, because as her student enrollment went down, as students stayed home, as the children stayed home, what she was left with were the children of first responders and healthcare providers who needed some place for their children to go so that they could be at the hospital, as it were. But that didn't sustain her business. And she was looking at losing a business that she had successfully operated for 31 years. She ultimately got her PPP loan, which was a forgivable loan, becomes a grant if you meet certain criteria. But in addition to that, we have provided significant funds to create the production of personal protective equipment. And I think anybody who is in a circumstance like dealing with children should be able to have access to affordable personal protective equipment so that they can provide that. If we can't provide childcare or open up our schools on a safe basis, then we can't restart this economy.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Rachel on Twitter. What are you doing to prevent schools from losing the arts? Superintendent Reykdal?
Yeah, so boy, there's a lot here, and I'll kind of get through it quickly. When I first got this job 3.5 years ago, I knew, as the congressman had mentioned, that our sort of standardized testing obsession was starting to eat into some other areas, because what was the answer for a kid who's struggling with math? Well, you remediate a bunch of math, and then you lose other options for that student. So I had my team dive in, and there were 3 presumptions in our state. Arts were hurting, career and technical education was hurting, and social studies was hurting as a result of our sort of test obsession. It turns out that art definitely had some impacts. It wasn't really in the performing arts, though. The band and choir world tends to go right to their voters and say, if you don't pass levies, then we have to cut band. And so bands held up well, but some of the fine arts definitely had some struggle. Career and tech ed took a little bit of a hit. We've already gotten it back. In fact, we're growing CT in high school and middle school again. What really got hammered was social studies. As the math requirements went up and the science requirements, kids lost economics and sociology and psychology and elective history classes. And so we balanced this by making clear to our students that basic ed is not just about 3 subjects. Art is fundamentally a part of basic education. It doesn't have as many credit requirements in high school as English language arts or some other things, but it is so fundamental to the success of kids. So we have really made a push here at OSPI to maintain that. I'm glad they are very stabilized. It's tougher to do for a lot of the mediums when kids are at home, which is another reason to get us back, right? Those are our art studios for young people. I will make a gratuitous plug right now for this Thursday at 3 o'clock. For our first time, we will live feed Facebook Live our annual art show. It showcases art in lots of mediums from students all across the state. They compete, if you will, at the local level, and then it goes to a regional level, and then to the state level. I pick a piece, the governor picks a piece, the principals group, our superintendents, the state board. We have this awesome opportunity to really highlight students and their talents. We've got to keep the arts. It is about expression. It is about basic ed. It keeps kids engaged. It's so valuable in their learning. It transforms the way the mind is the brain is mapped and functions. And if you spend any time in downtowns, you know that between culinary arts and fine arts, many downtowns in this state, in this country, would be in shambles if not for the economic success that the arts create. So it touches every aspect of our lives, and we are all in making sure people know it's basic ed.
I just might mention that even on a remote basis, our art teachers and our performing arts teachers are finding creative and innovative ways to continue to teach. North Thurston School District had, I believe, 6 choir teachers come together and somehow managed to record a singing of one of the greatest songs ever written, in my humble opinion, Yesterday by the Beatles, for choir students. And if you go on the North Thurston School District site, I think you can see it. And I think you'll find it quite inspiring. Chris, thank you very much for that. Thank you.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Darcy, a live viewer. Have you considered that bus drivers need to be empowered to refuse to transport an obviously ill child? Too often children are sent to school when they clearly shouldn't have been. Superintendent Reykdal?
Yeah, it's a really powerful question, because as we think about the world of COVID and screening for kids to make sure they're safe, we're trying to observe other states and other countries. And when do they do that screening? Is it when they come on the bus, which certainly can slow routes but creates the safest opportunity? Or do you socially distance on the bus with lots of protection, including some plexiglass in some countries? And then you screen them before they're allowed to come into classrooms or buildings. So again, this large task force is going through that kind of level of detail on how to effectively do this. But I really share your expression here of concern, because for a long time, for some really obvious reasons. Families have had a hard time keeping kids home because if you're somebody who has to go to work and your job's in jeopardy, it's tough. And so a lot of times you find the default is I'll send them to school and hope they keep my kid. In a world of COVID where fever is such a significant indicator of viral load and ultimately viral cases, we're going to be taking a much harder look at that. And parents should expect that if their kid has a fever, they're being sent home in the future, at least until we get to a vaccine on this thing. But there will be a lot more attention on fever and what it expresses to us in terms of a kid's health and safety.
Thank you. Going back to the art question for a moment, I just want to plug that we are hosting the Congressional Art Competition for Washington 10th residents. So high school artists can submit their piece of art and the information is on our website.
Lauren, we should mention that the winner of that is given 2 free tickets at the point at which it's actually able to be accomplished now, to fly to Washington, D.C., both the art winner and a guest of their choosing. And that artwork is actually hung in the tunnel between the House office buildings and the United States Capitol building. There's just one piece of art per congressional district that is selected among the competition, but you therefore walk down this long tunnel and see more than 435 pieces of student art, which are rotated out every year. And some of it is pretty spectacular, let me tell you. It's actually like being in a pretty high-end art gallery, seeing what some of these students can produce. And I hope that as many students as possible or are so inclined will participate.
Great. Our next question comes from Michael and is a Facebook Live viewer. Is there a way to streamline acquiring school supplies? We all know how packed the stores get in August. Could we, the parents, just send in a check? Superintendent Reykdal?
Boy, this is an awesome question. So right now we're really focused on the PPE and the procurement of that and doing that at scale, thinking about purchasing regionally instead of each school district. And the planning hasn't quite gotten to the level of how do we purchase adequate supplies for kids, because your well taken point is that we put that on a million families around the state every fall, and they race off to Fred Meyer or wherever else with their list, and they attempt to buy supplies. At this point, the group hasn't really contemplated that too much. They will, because one of the CDC recommendations is that kids don't share supplies, and that's really hard to operationalize in a classroom. But increasingly this fall, it might be very much so that kids secure their supplies and be used only for them. And so we'd have to figure out if this is the year to really implement bulk purchasing and shared services. I will say, let's hope that we can continue to evolve our basic ed model so that someday families are not buying pencils and pens. It is one thing to send your kid to school with a backpack, and it's got to be one that makes them look cool. I've got 2 teenagers, and they would never let anyone purchase their backpack but themselves. But gosh, some of these common supplies really should be a function of basic ed, and we should not be charging families for that. And we've been moving that direction. It's been getting better, but this might be a bit of a setback if budgets get kind of tough for our districts.
On a related note, we have another question from Facebook from Jackie. Will schools be funded for all the extra staff and supplies that will be needed in order to comply with social distancing in the fall?
It's a dialogue we're already in with the legislature. You know, they're going to be attempting to balance an $8 billion hole in their budget and not inclined to spend additional money. But they certainly know that there are parts of our operation that will cost more in this. If you can't put all those kids on a bus and legally you're still required to transport them, there's an added cost there, and we have to get really creative about how to do that. We're going to make the case. We're going to make the case for some of our operations. Absolutely, the labor costs that go involved with more cleaning of our buildings and our facilities and the supplies that go with them. Districts are trying to be creative now and really thinking through the scenario where they don't get more money, but our legislature will have to do more than just think about this as a reduction moment. They'll have to be thinking creatively about a short-term challenge where we are going to need some additional resources to do this really well. Very, very tough. I'm glad I'm in my seat. It's a 16-hour day pretty regularly, but I was a 3-term legislator as Congressman Heck was as a legislator. These are the toughest moments when you serve. These are absolutely the toughest moments. People will tell you they cannot afford more tax, and some of them cannot. And then they will also tell you that they want more services, though, because we're in a moment of crisis. So between what we can do here and hopefully what Congress can continue to do to help the states, it could be a great opportunity for us to bridge the next year or two and get to more stable times.
So most of you are probably aware that last week Congress, at least on the House of Representatives side, passed the HEROES Act. That's an acronym, but basically it's the next installment of assistance to deal with the COVID crisis. It was a $3 trillion bill. Now, to put that in perspective, the previous 4 bills that we passed taken together were $3 trillion. That's a lot of money. And the single largest component of that money was aid to local and state government. $500 billion of it was direct aid to state governments to compensate for the fact that their revenues have been falling off the table. And what that means is that all of that budget pressure that goes on to all those non-K-12 areas, and that 3.5% in K-12 that is still subject to reduction, the legislature and the governor would have resources to compensate for it. So they wouldn't have to engage in the reduction of services to vulnerable people. So they wouldn't have to lay off people and contribute to a continuing high unemployment rate. And I am optimistic, despite what some of the public rhetoric has been, that in the not too distant future, Congress will provide substantial additional resources to help local and state government. Every mainstream economist says this is what should happen in order to help the economy from being in even worse shape than it already is. But as it relates to the legislature, Chris, do you anticipate a special session prior to the beginning of the school year?
Yes. Yes. I mean, at a minimum, I think they have had discussions about giving the governor the ability to access our rainy day fund. They've done a great job saving for a moment like this. Now, no one thought about a once in 100-year pandemic, but they have saved, they have put money away. And that's why, if I can be candid, that's why you have rainy day funds, to avoid cuts and reductions and risks when you need it. We've had a few folks in this state, every time the legislature saves money like a responsible family, they say, now give that all away. And I get that sentiment, but I'm really grateful that this cushion is here, because it will save jobs and ultimately save systems that support vulnerable people.
Thank you. Our next question comes from Madison, a live viewer. Will there be recommendations on statewide essential standards given the loss of instructional time this school year?
The answer is yes. We are loath to pick learning standards here at OSPI. We think that's the function of high quality teachers who we have all over our state. They make this determination, but we also know that we've given a very big menu of what learning standards are by grade level and by subject. And candidly, there's just too many. And so we definitely think it is the wise thing to do to find those really essential learning standards and manage our students' time and energies to learning those so they can have success in the next grade, in the next class. And the more we move to learning standards and what students really need to know to be successful, the less we will be judging students by the volume of homework they can do, right? Or the volume of extra credit that they get. There is a homework gap in this country. If your parents are at home and can spend time with you, if you have access to great technology and high-speed connectivity, and you have time and resources, you do better in a world where lots of homework goes home and you're expected to do that. If you're a young person who goes home and you have to work, you're a high school student, or your parents aren't there because they're working, it's harder to have success with homework. So we've had a system, quite frankly, evaluating volume for the last couple of decades instead of actual measurement towards learning standards. And this moment has given us a chance to rethink that. We've been moving that way slowly. I think our elementary teachers have done a really good job moving that direction. It's time to make that systemic. Fewer learning standards, be more intentional about them, focus on evaluating what students really know and are able to do, and less on how much volume of work they can produce. Kids are stressed. They need to focus on learning standards.
Great, thank you. So we are almost out of time, so I'm going to ask one last question, and then I'll turn it over to the Congressman for some closing remarks. Our last question comes from Christina, a live viewer. What is this plan specifically for sports, beginning in the fall and moving forward? Superintendent Reykdal?
This is where I want my screen to go fuzzy and I can't answer it. bad connection and all that. So I will say that sports, music, as we talked about, other activities, sometimes our kids are there for the holistic experience of our schools. It means a lot to them to be engaged in these things. It makes for a whole child. It's their fitness plan, it's their connection, it's community. So we don't separate this opportunity from learning. We intend that if we can get our schools open this fall, that we're going to have sports this fall. But there is a regulator out there. There are health guidelines that will put some restrictions on, and we don't know what they look like right now. So we don't know if we can play football in the traditional sense. I can tell you pretty confidently that if we can, we're not going to be shoulder to shoulder sitting in stadiums on Friday nights this September. That would probably not work under any of the governor's phases. So it could be a very different experience for fans. And it might be that parents and close family are the ones who get to spectate this fall, and not everybody. But again, there's a lot of health guidance we're still waiting on. Maybe this is the fighting moment for cross country, and we will all be runners where we can get lots of feet apart from each other, and our contact sports are going to be a little harder to pull off. But we are trying to make this a viable option this fall and beyond, because it means so much for young people. It connects them to schools and community, and it's a part of their expression, and it's good for them. So we're trying to make it happen.
The only thing I would add to that is we should all be proud in Washington as being the place of the #1 ranked preseason college basketball team in America. I'm not going to go into who that is, but it's a school about 90 miles to the north of the one that Chris graduated summa cum laude from.
That hurts.
Sorry, Chris. Oh, sorry, Chris. Before I make concluding remarks, would you like to say anything in summary or in conclusion, Chris?
Just a big thank you to you, Congressman Heck, for the opportunity to share some time here with you and keep the great partnership going. To everybody in Washington, this has been tough. I know there's consternation about what a closure means, and I know we read headlines about people who are frustrated by it, but please rest assured, we did a lot of the right stuff together. We focused on public health, and it mattered a lot. We didn't have the big spike. We saved lives. We didn't have overrun hospital systems, but the risk is still there. So we got to wash hands. We got to wear face masks in public. We got to focus on our hygiene and our distancing, and then we can have a more successful jumpstart to the economy, a more successful school opening. But it's a moment of sacrifice. And my parents both were kids in World War II, and they told me about sacrifice and savings and not being able to do some of the stuff they want to do. It's what we do together to be collective Americans in success. And this is our moment to shine. So I challenge everyone to keep it up. It mattered a lot then. It's going to matter a lot in the next year, and we will get through it together. So thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Those were inspiring words, and I appreciate them very much. As I appreciate your presence here today, I think, as I said at the outset, we have been very, very well served by the presence of Chris Reykdal as our Superintendent of Public Instruction, and that was on full display here. And I thank each and every one of you for being here. As I am inclined to say and express in all sincerity, you have given us your most precious commodity, your time. I hope you found it helpful. This is the 9th or the 10th in our series of conversations with people about the effects of the COVID crisis and how we're dealing with it. We have several coming up, including one, I might add, with Washington State Attorney General Bob Ferguson. Between now and then, just to reiterate what Superintendent Reykdal has indicated, stay safe, wash your hands, practice social distancing, and we will get through this. Thank you very much for joining us.